The laughter came like a wave, sharp, echoing, cruel. Crystal glasses trembled in manicured hands as Elena Sinclair's guests threw their heads back, the golden light of the chandelier catching their fake smiles. The marble floors of the Sinclair mansion glistened like ice beneath the guests' polished shoes. Every sound, the clinking of champagne, the flutter of designer gowns, carried the rhythm of wealth and arrogance. And there, standing near the corner by the grand piano, was Amara. A soft voice, a steady hand, a woman invisible to the world that floated above her. She had only been in this mansion for 2 weeks. Every morning began before dawn, dusting portraits of people who never smiled, polishing silver that reflected faces who never looked back. She spoke softly, always careful. But tonight, when she stepped into that ballroom, the air thick with perfume and ego, something inside her told her to stand tall. Maybe it was the way her mother's words still echoed in her mind. Never bow to the world, my daughter, even when it forgets your name. As she poured wine into crystal glasses, the scent of roses and expensive cigars lingered. Elena Sinclair, wrapped in a dress worth more than most people's homes, watched her with lazy amusement. Elena had built her empire on charm and cruelty, both sharpened to perfection. She was the kind of woman who didn't just own power, she performed it. And tonight, her stage was the ballroom. Amara turned, her accent soft, polite, careful. "Madam, should I bring more wine?" The words fell gentle into the air like a feather, but Elena's lips twisted. The room went quiet, and then laughter. Loud, sharp, humiliating. "Did you hear that?" Elena mocked, her voice rising above the music. "Wine, not wine." She mimicked Amara's accent, dragging the vowels, exaggerating them for her audience. The crowd roared. The sound filled the marble hall, bounced off chandeliers, echoed into Amara's bones. For a moment time froze, the music stopped. The laughter pressed in on her like heat. Her hands shook, the silver tray trembling ever so slightly. Her eyes flicked toward Elena, and then she looked straight at her. Not down, not away. Straight at her. That gaze, calm, steady, unbreaking, cut through the laughter like a knife. For the first time that night, Elena's voice faltered. The mockery lingered in the air, unfinished, awkward. Guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to keep laughing or pretend they hadn't heard. But Amara said nothing. She didn't need to. The silence was her weapon. And yet the room swallowed her pride whole. The laughter started again, softer this time, like nervous applause to fill the shame that no one wanted to feel. Amara turned, placed the wine bottle back on the table, and disappeared toward the service corridor, her heart beat loud in her chest, but her head held high. In the kitchen, she let out the breath she had been holding. The sound of laughter still echoed in her ears. Her reflection in the polished steel counter looked back at her, eyes tired, lips trembling. She pressed her palm against her heart, whispering in her native tongue, "They can laugh at my words, but not at my worth." Upstairs, Elena's party continued. The music resumed, the glasses clinked, but something in that ballroom had shifted. Guests began whispering, not about Elena's diamonds, but about the look the maid had given her, a look that held something untouchable. Later that night, as the last guest left and the mansion quieted, Elena found herself packing before the mirror. She poured another glass of champagne, but it didn't taste as sweet. The echo of her own laughter replayed in her mind, shrill, heartless. "Why am I thinking about her?" she muttered. But she couldn't shake that stare, that dignity in silence. It haunted her. Meanwhile, in the small servant quarters at the far end of the estate, Amara sat by the window, staring out at the night sky. The moonlight painted her face with silver. On the small wooden table lay an old, faded photograph, her mother standing beside a man in a United Nations jacket. A symbol, worn but visible, marked the corner, a crest that hadn't been seen publicly in years. She traced it gently with her thumb, whispering, "I will find them. I will finish what they began." Outside, the wind brushed against the tall cypress trees that lined the Sinclair estate. The night carried whispers of something more, something hidden beneath the surface of humiliation and laughter. The next morning, gossip had already spread through the mansion staff. Miss Sinclair mocked the new maid, one whispered. But that maid, she didn't cry, she just looked her in the eyes, gave her that look. They spoke of her with a mix of fear and awe, because no one had ever done that to Alina Sinclair, not the investors, not the board members, not even the politicians who came begging for her money. By noon, word had reached even the security team. They laughed about it too, but their laughter felt uneasy, like they weren't sure what exactly they were laughing at. Power trembled when dignity refused to kneel. That evening, when Alina sat in her study, scrolling through her phone, she noticed something strange, a news alert. United Nations resumes search for missing humanitarian heiress. She almost scrolled past it until she saw the name, Amara K. Osai. The photo was old, blurry, but the resemblance made her freeze. The headline mentioned a lost inheritance, a secret trust, and a missing daughter of a world-famous diplomat who had vanished years ago after a coup in West Africa. Alina's glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the marble floor. She stood there, heart pounding, replaying last night in her mind. The accent she mocked, the calm defiance, the eyes full of something ancient and noble. It couldn't be. But deep down, Alina knew it was true. The maid she had humiliated was no ordinary woman. She was born of power, not the kind you can buy, but the kind that lives in the soul. Downstairs, as Amara folded linens, she felt the shift in the air. Something had changed. Something she had spent years hiding was beginning to surface. She looked toward the mansion door, whispering to herself, "They can mock my voice, but one day they will hear my story." The world outside the Sinclair estate still believed Amara was a servant, but behind those quiet eyes, history was stirring. The same legacy that once united nations now slept beneath her humility, waiting for the right moment to awaken. And as the night fell once more over the glowing mansion, one truth lingered in the silence. The laughter that mocked her accent would soon echo as regret, because sometimes the voices we belittle are the ones destined to change the world. The days that followed felt like a slow storm building inside marble walls. The mansion, once just cold, now felt cruel. Every step Amara took echoed through its halls like a reminder that she didn't belong. Every morning, her reflection in the silver trays whispered the same question, "How much longer will you endure this?" But she did. She endured because strength was her inheritance and silence her weapon. Alina Sinclair's voice filled the air like poison perfume. "Maybe you should stick to cleaning floors, not English words," she'd say, her laughter rolling through the room like thunder. The guests would chuckle politely, eager to stay on her good side. Even the other servants began to drift away from Amara, their eyes filled with quiet fear. They had families to feed, children depending on them. No one wanted to be seen standing too close to the maid, who had become the target of Alina's cruel amusement. Amara felt the isolation like a shadow. She worked longer hours, ate in silence, and learned to keep her head low, at least during the day. But every night, when the mansion slept and the lights dimmed, something inside her refused to bow. In her small room tucked beneath the grand staircase, she would sit by the flickering bulb and unfold that one piece of her past she had left, an old, creased letter. The paper was thin, yellowed at the edges, the ink faded but powerful. At the top, a blue United Nations emblem half-smeared, but still shining faintly. Beneath it, her mother's handwriting, soft and precise. "When the time comes, show them who you are." Those words became her prayer, her heartbeat, her fuel. She whispered them into the silence, again and again, until her voice no longer trembled. The same accent they mocked became a melody, firm, rhythmic, filled with conviction. Some nights she would stand before the cracked mirror, practicing, "My name is Amara K. Osai." The words came out steady. She repeated them until they carried power. "I am the daughter of unity. I am not afraid." Outside her window, the wind moved through the trees like an unseen audience. It felt as if the universe itself was listening. Meanwhile, upstairs, Alina Sinclair prepared for her next event, her grandest yet. the annual Sinclair Foundation Gala, a night of elegance, cameras, and headlines. Diplomats, journalists, and ambassadors from around the world would attend. It was her chance to flaunt power and charm, to remind everyone that she still ruled her empire with grace. But grace without compassion is just arrogance in disguise. Elena called for Amara that afternoon, her tone sharp, impatient. "You'll serve drinks at the gala," she said, not looking up from her mirror. "And please, try not to speak too much. We don't want anyone confusing the guests with your exotic sounds." Amara said nothing. She only nodded, but in her silence there was a storm rising. Every insult, every smirk, every burst of laughter that had once broken her heart now became fuel. The same words that once wounded her now sharpened her purpose. As the day of the gala arrived, the mansion transformed into a kingdom of light and luxury. Golden chandeliers shimmered. Musicians tuned their instruments. The scent of orchids filled the air. Outside, luxury cars lined the driveway, each one carrying people who shaped nations. Elena wore a gown of silver silk, her diamonds blazing like tiny suns. She moved through the room like she owned the world, and perhaps, in her mind, she did. And there was Amara, dressed in plain black uniform, her hair neatly tied back, her eyes steady. She moved quietly through the crowd, balancing trays of champagne, weaving between laughter and power. But tonight, she wasn't just a servant. She was a secret waiting to be spoken. Everywhere she turned, she saw faces she recognized, from newspapers, from her mother's stories, from memories she'd buried long ago. Ambassadors who once stood beside her parents in peace conferences. Journalists who had covered her mother's disappearance. The UN Secretary's advisor, his voice unmistakable, his presence heavy. Fate wasn't just nearby, it was standing in the same room. Elena noticed the subtle tension in the air but dismissed it. "Smile," she whispered to herself, adjusting her necklace as cameras began flashing. "Tonight, we make history." But history was already in motion, just not the kind Elena expected. When Amara approached the central table to serve the UN delegation, a familiar emblem caught her eye, embroidered on a diplomat's sleeve. The same blue symbol that lived on her mother's letter. Her hands trembled slightly and the tray tilted, but she steadied it before anyone noticed, or so she thought. The diplomat, an older man with kind eyes, looked up at her and froze, his brows furrowed as if trying to recall a distant memory. "Excuse me," he said softly, "what did you say your name was?" Elena, overhearing, turned sharply, her voice cut through the music. "Her name doesn't matter," she said, forcing a laugh. "She's just our help. Please enjoy your drink." But the diplomat didn't move. He looked at Amara, studying her face, the curve of her jaw, the shade of her skin. His expression shifted from curiosity to disbelief. "You look just like," he began, his voice cracking. "It can't be." The room seemed to pause. The music quieted, conversations hushed. Elena tried to wave it off with another brittle laugh, but something had broken the illusion. People began to look at Amara, at Elena, at the tension forming between them. Amara's heart pounded, but her mother's words echoed inside her. "When the time comes, show them who you are." She set the tray down on the table. Her voice was calm, but it carried weight. "My name," she said, "is Amara K. Osei." Her accent filled the air, strong, unapologetic. "I am the daughter of Amina Osei, former UN ambassador." Gasps rippled through the hall. Cameras turned. Faces twisted in shock. Elena's glass slipped from her hand and shattered against the floor. The diplomat rose to his feet, his eyes wide with emotion. "It's true," he whispered. "You were lost after the coup. We thought you were dead." Elena tried to regain her composure, stammering, "This is absurd. She's lying." But no one listened. The weight of the truth had already shifted the room. The power that once belonged to Elena was gone, replaced by the quiet authority of the woman she had humiliated. Amara stood there, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "You mocked my voice," she said softly, looking directly at Elena. But that voice carries generations. My mother spoke with this accent at the United Nations. My people prayed with it. You tried to turn it into shame, but tonight it becomes power. The room erupted, murmurs, tears, applause. Some clapped, some simply stared in awe. Elena stood frozen, stripped of her arrogance, her face pale beneath the chandelier's glow. And yet, amid all the chaos, Amara's gaze softened. She didn't smile, she didn't gloat. She only whispered, "Respect is not something you can buy, madam. It's something you give or lose forever." The gala continued, but nothing was the same. The cameras that had come to celebrate Elena's empire now turned toward Amara, the maid with the accent that carried the sound of truth. And as the night faded, one truth hung in the air like a final note. The weight of injustice may crush the body, but it cannot silence the soul. The ballroom shimmered under the light of 100 cameras, each flash slicing through the air like lightning. The music had faded, but the tension still hummed, quiet, electric, waiting. The whispers were still circling from what Amara had revealed moments ago, her name still hanging in the air like something sacred. Amara K. Osei, the name that shattered a billionaire's pride and rewrote every lie spoken beneath this chandelier. Elena stood frozen near the grand staircase, her fingers clutching her champagne glass so tightly it could have cracked. She wanted to laugh it off, to control the room again, but her voice refused to obey. The audience's eyes had already turned away from her. All of them now looked toward the young black woman who had just revealed herself not as a servant, but as something far greater. Then the heavy doors of the mansion opened. A cold gust of air swept in, carrying the sound of polished shoes and authority. A tall man stepped through, dressed in a dark navy suit with a gold pin gleaming on his lapel. His face was calm, professional, but his presence cut through the noise like thunder. The guests whispered among themselves, leaning to see. Cameras turned, flashes bursting again. The man reached into his coat and displayed a badge. The words shone under the light, United Nations Diplomatic Security. The room gasped in unison. His voice was firm but respectful. "We are here for Miss Amara Ademi." The name rippled across the room like a shockwave. Amara's breath caught. For a second, she thought she'd misheard. The old name, her real name, echoed in her chest like a heartbeat she had forgotten she still had. Elena forced a laugh, sharp and nervous. Surely you're mistaken. She's the maid, my housekeeper." Her words stumbled over themselves, thin and desperate. "You can't be serious." The officer didn't flinch. His tone remained calm, his eyes steady on Amara. "No, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying authority that needed no volume. "She's the biological daughter of the late Ambassador Ademi, the United Nations Chief of Humanitarian Affairs. We've been searching for her for years." A collective gasp rose through the hall. Someone dropped a glass. Another whispered, "Ambassador Ademi." The crowd began to buzz like a hive. Reporters raised their cameras higher. Every lens turned to Amara, capturing the moment history decided to stop pretending. Elena's face lost its color. The smirk that once ruled every room vanished. Her lips trembled as she tried to form words, but none came. For the first time, she was speechless, stripped of the armor of arrogance she had always worn. Around her, the crowd stepped back, the same people who once laughed at her jokes, now unwilling to stand beside her shame. Amara didn't move. She stood still, her eyes glistening not from pride, but from something deeper, purer. Her silence spoke more powerfully than any speech could. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, even gentle, carrying the same grace her mother once had. "You mocked my voice," she said softly, turning toward Elena. "But it carried the same words my father once spoke at the United Nations, for dignity, for peace." The cameras flashed. You could hear the faint shutter click as tears caught the light on Amara's cheek. She didn't hide them. They weren't tears of weakness. They were truth. The officer nodded respectfully. "Miss Ademi," he said, "your father's estate and title have been reinstated by the United Nations Council. The world has been waiting for you." Elena stumbled backward, disbelief spreading across her face like cracks in glass. "No, this can't be real," she whispered. "She's a servant. She cleans my home." Amara turned to her, her gaze steady, not cruel, not vengeful, but filled with quiet strength. "You mistook humility for weakness," she said, "but service doesn't make one small. It's the heart behind it that makes it noble." Her words floated through the room, heavy with truth. The guests who once sneered now looked away, shame glowing on their faces. Elena opened her mouth to defend herself, but nothing came. Her empire of pride had collapsed in front of flashing lights and quiet dignity. The officer stepped forward, offering Amara his hand. "Miss Adami, if you're ready." Amara hesitated for a moment, glancing around the room that had been her prison, the polished floors, the glittering chandelier, the echoes of laughter that once crushed her spirit. She saw the servants standing at the edges, their eyes wide with hope, with pride, with something they hadn't felt in years. She smiled softly at them, a silent promise that their worth would never again be measured by the hands they served. Elena's voice broke the silence, desperate and trembling. "Amara, wait. I didn't know, I didn't mean." Amara turned back, her expression calm. "You didn't need to know who I was to treat me with respect," she said. "Humanity should never depend on status." The room went still. Even the air seemed to listen. Elena lowered her gaze, tears of humiliation and regret pooling in her eyes. Amara looked at her for a long moment, then gave a faint nod, a gesture of forgiveness, not spoken but understood. That single act, quiet and graceful, carried more power than any vengeance could. Then she walked forward, the officer beside her. As she moved through the crowd, the people parted for her like the sea, watching in stunned silence. The same woman they had mocked for her accent now carried herself like royalty because she was. But it wasn't her title that made her noble. It was the way she carried her pain without letting it turn to hate. The cameras followed her as she approached the grand doors. Each step echoed across marble, heavy with history. When she reached the threshold, she turned one last time. The chandelier light shimmered on her skin, and her voice, soft but unwavering, filled the hall. "No one is beneath respect. Remember that." And with that, she stepped out into the night, no longer a maid, no longer a secret, but a living symbol of grace reborn. The doors closed behind her with a quiet finality. Inside, Elena stood alone under the same chandelier that once made her feel untouchable. Now, its light only exposed her shame. The guests avoided her eyes. The laughter that had once crowned her nights had vanished, replaced by the echo of Amara's words. Outside, Amara lifted her face to the cold night air. The stars above glittered like 1,000 watching souls. For the first time in years, she felt the weight lift from her shoulders. Her father's words came back to her, the same ones her mother once whispered before every journey. "Dignity is not what the world gives you, my child. It's what you keep, even when the world tries to take it away." And as the cars drove her toward a new life, the world that had once laughed at her accent was now listening to her voice, her truth, her power. Because respect, she realized, is not found in titles or riches. It is born in how we treat those we think are beneath us and how they rise when we forget to look down. Elena sat in that vast, echoing ballroom again, but this time there was no music, no chatter, no glittering champagne glasses to fill the silence. The chandeliers still sparkled overhead, but their light felt colder now, as if the crystals themselves were mourning something she couldn't quite name. Her hands rested on the same polished mahogany table where she once sat surrounded by power, influence, and pride. But tonight she sat alone, a queen without her court, her laughter replaced by the sound of her own breathing. The world had moved on since that night. The headlines had been relentless. Clips of Amara's humiliation had gone viral, and then, just as quickly, the story had flipped. People began to learn who Amara really was. Not a maid, not a housekeeper, but a woman with degrees, awards, and a voice that refused to be silenced. When the truth surfaced, so did the shame. Elena's name had become a whisper of disgrace in the same social circles where she once reigned supreme. The people who used to crowd around her for favors now kept their distance. The phone that once buzzed with invitations now sat still. Outside, autumn leaves scattered across the marble steps of her mansion. The world felt quieter now, painfully quiet. That quietness had a way of forcing her to listen, not to others, but to herself. For weeks, she avoided the mirror because she couldn't face the woman in it, the one who had mocked kindness, who had mistaken humility for weakness. Then one morning, as the housekeeper brought in the mail, she noticed an envelope unlike the rest. Heavy, cream-colored, sealed with a blue and white insignia, the United Nations emblem. Elena's pulse skipped. Her fingers trembled slightly as she broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten note, elegant and simple. True power is not in wealth, but in how you treat those who serve you. Amara Ademi. Elena froze. The handwriting was beautiful, strong strokes, confident curves, as if every letter carried the weight of grace. For a moment, she didn't breathe. The woman she had humiliated had taken the time to write her, not in anger, not in bitterness, but in mercy. She sank into the nearest chair. The note felt heavier than it should, not because of the paper, but because of what it carried. Guilt, yes, but also forgiveness, a kind she didn't think she deserved. Her throat tightened as she stared at the words, reading them again and again. That afternoon, as sunlight poured through the tall windows, Elena turned on the television. The channel showed a live broadcast from New York, the UN General Assembly. Cameras panned across flags from every nation. At the podium stood Amara Ademi, dressed in a deep emerald gown that shimmered under the lights. Her presence was radiant, not loud, not demanding, but powerful in its calm. Elena leaned forward, her heart pounded. She hadn't heard Amara's voice since that night, the night she had mocked it in front of her guests. But when Amara spoke, that same accent filled the room again, rich, warm, rhythmic, the kind of voice that carried both pain and pride. For too long, Amara began, her tone steady, the world has mistaken accent for ignorance. It has silenced brilliance because it did not sound familiar. It has dismissed worth because it did not wear wealth. The audience sat in complete silence. Every camera lens fixed on her, every word captured. Elena could feel the room's energy even through the screen, the stillness, the respect, the dawning realization in the faces of diplomats and leaders. Amara continued, her voice unwavering. But our voices, every one of them, hold power. The power to heal, to teach, to lead. We come from different lands, but our dignity is the same. And when you mock a voice, you mock the story it carries. Elena's eyes filled. She clutched the note tighter in her hand. Her mind flashed back to that cruel moment in her own home, the laughter, the way she had imitated Amara's words, the way everyone had joined in. She could still hear the echo of that laughter bouncing off the marble floors. But now, that sound haunted her. The screen showed a standing ovation, the hall filled with applause. Amara smiled humbly and stepped back from the podium, her eyes glistening but her head held high. She had forgiven without forgetting. She had risen without revenge. Elena reached for the remote and turned off the television. The silence that followed was heavy but not empty. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel powerful. She felt small, human, breakable. And strangely, that humility brought her peace. She looked around the vast hall that had once hosted senators and CEOs. Tonight, it felt like a museum of vanity. The gold frames, the portraits, the trophies, all of it suddenly seemed meaningless. What did it matter if she had wealth, if she had no grace? She took the letter and placed it on the center of the table. Her reflection shimmered faintly in its glass top. For the first time, she didn't turn away. She faced the woman staring back at her, the woman who was learning, slowly, painfully, what it meant to be truly powerful. Weeks later, she donated the ballroom to a local community foundation. It became a place for young women to gather, to learn, to speak, no matter their accent, their origin, or their story. Every time she walked past that hall, she felt Amara's words echo inside her. True power is not in wealth, but in how you treat those who serve you. And in those words, she found redemption not from others, but from herself. Because Elena finally understood what power really meant, not the kind that controls, not the kind that humiliates, but the kind that uplifts. The kind that says, I see you, I hear you, and your voice matters. And so, as the last light of day faded over the mansion she once ruled, Elena whispered softly into the stillness, "Forgive me." Maybe no one heard, but somewhere, perhaps Amara did, and smiled. The story of these two women became more than a scandal. It became a reminder that kindness carries farther than cruelty, that dignity can't be bought, and that the voice you mock today may one day speak for the world.